Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us for the LSE Africa Summit session on youth unemployment and migration in West and North Africa. We have an excellent panel today to take us through this topic, and I'm happy to welcome Professor Majid Hanoum, who is trained at the Sorbonne and Princeton University. Professor Hanoum is a professor of anthropology at University of Kansas in the United States. He is the editor of Practicing Sufism, Sufi Politics and Performance in Africa, which was published in 2016. His other publications include The Invention of the Maghreb Between Africa and the Middle East, which came out last year. He also published Living Tangier, Migration, Race and Illegality in a Moroccan City in 2020. Also Violent Modernity, France in Algeria, published in 2010. And Colonial Histories, Post-Colonial Memories, The Legend of Kahina, a North Africa Heroine, published in 2001. Professor Hanoum was a researcher at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He was also a fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Study at Harvard University, a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University, a senior Fulbright fellow, and a senior fellow at the Aga Khan Center in London. So without further ado, I will ask Professor Hanoum to make his introductory remarks. And the way we will organize this panel today will be 10-minute introductory remarks by Professor Hanoum, and then by Professor Mbaye, who is our second speaker. And then we will have a conversation between moderator and speakers for about 10 to 15 minutes. And from there, we will open up to questions from the audience. So Professor Hanoum, you have the floor.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I will be talking today about why do African youth migrate? And as a matter of fact, like my question is a little bit more specific. I will be asking the question of why do African youth migrate despite the fact that this enterprise is extremely dangerous and it's associated with a high rate of death, especially in sea, but partly also in the desert. I would like to share with you this screen. Just to give you an idea about the type of stereotype that's associated to African migration to Europe. Basically, this is from the Time magazine, and you can clearly see the continent as a prison, and then you have these Africans like skinny and starving, trying to get out. There is also this one, which is a little bit more realistic because it's a photo. This is like man in the boat that you can see in the internet all the time. And these two images convey really a stereotype that's consistent with the stereotype that exists about Africa. Basically, it's a continent of poor people. It's a continent of misery. It's a continent of droughts. It's a continent of disease. And it's a continent of coup d'etat. And that's why people try to get the hell out, so that they can seek a better life. Basically, the explanation that it gives is not only it's an economist explanation, but really it's an explanation that has to do with a lot of stereotype revolving around the image of Africa that we have or that we had about before. So what I would like to do now is really to challenge this, the idea of youth migrating from Africa to Europe, resulting in high rate of death is real. We cannot deny that. For instance, in 2017, the International Organization for Migration declared that the Mediterranean Sea is the deadliest road for undocumented migration. And it gives numbers. I mean, for instance, out of 127,301 migrants, 3,139, dead or missing. So we can see the numbers here, like 2,275 dead or missing, 1,885 dead or missing, etc. So the numbers really, I mean, they look alarming. We have to keep in mind that these numbers do not touch just like the Africans who migrate to Europe via, usually like via Morocco, but also via Tunisia. It also has to do with other migrants that migrate, via Turkey, via Greece, and so forth. So the idea that I would like really to challenge here is whether this migration is driven by economic reasons. Before I do that, I really need to place this type of migration in what I call the general geography of migration. First of all, African intercontinental migration is more substantial than African migration to Europe, meaning more Africans migrate within Africa itself than they do from Africa to Europe. African migrants don't only migrate to Europe, they also migrate to the Americas, and they also migrate to the Gulf states. Now, we have other type of migration that are also new, like meaning that they go back to mid-1990s, which is basically European migration to other places, including European migration to the Gulf states, European migration to the Americas, that has a long history, and then European migration to African cities themselves, something really very new, where you have like middle class, and as a matter of fact, even working class Europeans moving from Europe, going to Morocco or to Kenya or to Senegal. So what we are talking about here is really like something that's global. That's usually like political scientists, anthropologists, they refer to it as globalization, which we have been told it's marked by movements and mobility of people, ideas, images, and so forth. So now, why do African youth migrate? Again, the idea of economy as a driven force, it really is not entirely like force. I mean, it's not something that we can just dismiss, but it's something that we have to kind of nuance. First of all, it has been noticed by scholars of migration that migration of poor countries is very, very limited. Meaning even in Africa itself, poor countries, they have less migrants, meaning less people who migrate. And people who migrate in poor countries, they usually migrate to neighboring countries. They don't migrate to faraway countries. Those that migrate to faraway countries usually are countries that are doing well economically. As a matter of fact, they are either developing or they are wealthy. Why? Because migration requires resources. Not anyone can migrate. It requires resources because when we say resources, it means money to migrate. It also means specific skills. It means all kinds of things that make migration possible. So let's see. So again, like when we say poverty is relative. Usually the United Nations measures poverty. And in the case of Africa, it measures by dollars, meaning like if you make less than $2 a day, you are poor. This is not the case of the migrants that I worked with. I worked with those migrants, African migrants, especially from West Africa and from Morocco, from 2008 to 2016. The first thing that I announced about this population is, the first thing that's so important is the fact that they are young. It's a young type of migration. The second thing that I announced about it is most of the migrants, they are not poor. As a matter of fact, even when I ask about their background, they are not poor. They were professionals or they had skills in their own countries. And the ones that are poor, they are really the minority. And most of them are from Morocco. There is a population that I will not talk about here, which is like basically children. It's a completely different case that I will not address. So again, if the population is young, if the migrant population is young, what does youth have to do with migration? First of all, I need to point out to the fact that African migration to Europe is not new. I mean, it's really old. The one that's new goes back to mid-1990s, and it has three characteristics. The first one, it's young. The second one, it's unwanted, and usually like the EU uses a legal language to say that. They say it's illegal. And the third one, it's fraught with danger. So this is a completely different pattern from what we have known before, let's say before 1990s, especially from 1940s, 50s to 1970s, when African migration was wanted. It was legal. As a matter of fact, it was sought after, meaning European companies, they used to go to Africa to look for labor. So the ones that we had in 1990s, it's completely different, again, because it's unwanted, it's dangerous, and it's young. So what does especially youth, because that's the first characteristic really, which in my opinion, the most important one, what does that have to do with migration? So considering the fact that I said that I'm not only looking at why do African youth migrate, I'm really looking at like, why do African youth migrate despite the high rates of death in this type of endeavor? The first answer that I need to tackle is youth has to do with movements. Youth has to do with really what we call, even what Hannah Arendt calls, the freedom to move. So youth, really, I mean, like, it's characterized by something that like, you need to know the world, you need to explore the world, you need to go somewhere. So that in itself is perceived like among these young people as like a will to freedom, The opposite of that is being stuck, So that's the first time, that's why like we find like, really, I mean, from 2008 to 2016, all the migrants that I have known, they are young. When I say young, they are like late teens and they're in their 20s. I only met one person one time who was 38 years old. So now, when we talk about this type of migration that's characterized by high rate of death, we ask the question about why do young people take the risk to die over the certainty to stay safe at home? So death is a total, complete like abstraction for young people. You see, when you are like 50 and more, death becomes a reality because you have lost people, because you yourself maybe got sick, you got into car accidents at one point. You kind of like experience like death either near or even usually in your surrounding. Young people, like very young people, they don't have that experience with death. So that's on one hand, like it's really a total, complete abstraction. Even when you show them the pictures of people that, who were dead, trying to cross. So the second thing that's also like connected with this is the fact that when you ask them and press them to answer, like, why do you want to cross? You may die, in sea. The answer is usually like, we are all going to die. And if I meant to die in sea, I will die in sea. I will die where I meant to die. So that's basically like, it's some kind of like philosophy that young people have, with migrants, that really makes them to defy, these concepts of death. Now, someone may say that, well, there's something that Mary Douglas calls the cult of safety. Basically, like as humans, we have this kind of desire for safety. Of course, we want to move, but we also want to be safe. So for the young migrants, crossing, and taking the risk, that itself is a demonstration that they adhere to the cult of safety. Because what's unsafe is to be stuck. What's unsafe is to stay home. What's unsafe is to stay in the same place over and over again, year after year. And you will lose and miss out a lot about the world around you. However, when you cross, you're also like crossing for safety, including safety to make it, including safety to become someone else, including safety to develop and prosper and so forth. That's where like, the economic factor might play in a little bit, So now, this topic is quite like controversial, like about death of migrants in sea. And we do have colleagues, especially in anthropology, who argued that like, well, that's a type of suicide. As I said, like, the youth do not think about it as suicide because they are firmly believe that they are going to cross, not that they're going to die. It's completely different. It's not, suicide is like when someone is doing something that they know is going to result in their death. The migrant doesn't think like that. They think that he's going to cross, not that he's going to die. And this is really consistent with something that we do every day. When I leave home to come to work, I think about I'm leaving home to go to work, to make a living. I don't think about I'm leaving home, to be hit by a car, which may happen. So now, Hannah Arendt associates movement with freedom, because as I said, like, freedom, it's sometimes so important, like it's universal, of course, that all humans want to be free, but also it's more acute with youth, with young people who really like want to kind of like feel that they live the world in all of its aspects, meaning not just in the same neighborhood, day after day, year after year. So the idea of exploring the world is an idea of freedom itself. And even if we agree with some anthropologists that this type of endeavor is suicide, according to Hannah Arendt, suicide itself may be the last supreme guarantee of human freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamoun. Thank you. And you can close your, yes, thank you very much. And welcome, Professor Mbaye, our second presenter in this webinar. Professor Hamadou Mbaye is the Vice Chancellor of the University Sheikh Anta Diop UCAD in Dakar, Senegal. He's a professor of economics and public policies, and he has more than 25 years of experience in this field. He has been a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and at the Center for Global Development in Washington, DC, both institutions in DC. And he has also been a senior research associate at the Center for Development Research at University of Bonn in Germany. Professor Mbaye is also a member of the African Economic Research Consortium's Program Committee. But in terms of research, Professor Mbaye has provided new and very impactful methodological frameworks for thinking about informality and the informal economy in Francophone African countries. He has developed a new concept of the informal sector, which challenges mainstream dichotomies of formal and informal economies. And he proposes an approach that is based on a continuum of degrees of formality. So we're looking forward to your presentation. So Professor Mbaye, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Please let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Hello? Do you all see my screen?
Yes, it's on. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like first to very much thank the organizers for bringing me in these very exciting discussions. And the topic of my presentation today is about structural transformation and unemployment in Africa, and showcasing the case of Senegal. I'm using the case of Senegal for two reasons. The one reason is that we have a lot of similarities across countries in Africa with regard to this, to structural transformation. And number two is that I have better data for Senegal than elsewhere. So I mainly will refer to Senegal throughout the presentation. And let me start by saying that in purely economic terms, migration is a normal phenomenon. When economists talk about migration, they very often refer to structural transformation as countries move from a state of underdevelopment to a state of development. In this movement, we observe two types of migration. The first type refers to labor moving out of agriculture to manufacturing. And then the second type is when manufacturing achieves a certain level of maturity, we then observe labor moving out of manufacturing to go to the service sector. So what we have in Africa is what Danny Roderick characterizes as premature deindustrialization, meaning that we have labor moving from agriculture, but not going to manufacturing, but going directly to the service sector, because manufacturing has some challenges to take off in Africa. So you understand me. My point will be mainly about internal migration rather than external migration. Indeed, when we talk about migration in Africa, it's mostly about internal migration. External migration is a very tiny share of overall migration in Africa. So what I'm going to focus on today is about internal migration and the underlying economic conditions shaping it. Let me just share with you some stylized facts about Africa. The first stylized fact I would like to share is about growth pattern. Many studies have agreed on one important fact, is that as far as economic growth is concerned, for a sustained period of time, African countries have performed better than comparable countries, in particular developing countries, even developed countries worldwide. What you see here is GDP values and growth rate. And you can see that we have a clearly increasing trend. So what we also observe in research is that these increase in growth doesn't translate into increase in jobs creation, in particular youth employment. If you look at the overall landscape of employment in Africa, here is what we observe, again, with Senegal's data. Here, on the top of my screen, you have the overall number of population of Senegal. And here you have the working age population. And out of these, here is the inactive population. And there you have the active population. And out of the active population, you have the unemployed. And here you have the employed. If you further break down employment, we can see that the private informal economy is employing the bulk of the active population. And the formal private sector and the formal public sector altogether are employing barely above 500,000 people. So out of a population of close to 9 million, you can see that around 500,000 people have a decent job. All the remainder have informal, precarious jobs. So this is one important fact I wanted to share with you. Another important fact I wanted to share with you is the pattern of working age population growth. You can see that growth of working age population is almost geometric. And to be more precise, in the 80s, we had each year 60,000 people, young people coming onto the job market. Right now,
Professor Mbaye, can I just interrupt you a minute? I think there is a concern that they cannot see your presentation very well. Can you enlarge a little bit? I think the data that you're presenting is so important that I would like everybody to be able to see it.
Okay, do you see them?
Yeah, it's Sena, is that better?
Professor Mbaye, could you press the present function on the presentation so that we can get a full expanded screen?
Is it better now?
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
yes,
that's
beautiful.
Perfect.
Thank you so
that's
much.
Perfect. I'm happy with that because it's so important. Everybody should be able to see those figures. Thank you. Please continue, Professor Mbaye.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. In the 80s, we had 60,000 young people entering every year the labor market. And now this number has increased to 300,000 people entering every year the labor market for Senegal. But again, the pattern is the same elsewhere in Africa. And this number is projected to achieve 500,000 people per annum in the next decade. And hence you have a very clear mismatch between supply and demand of labor. And again, when I talk about jobs, I'm referring to decent jobs, because in Africa, the very notion of unemployment is irrelevant, because people usually have jobs. The unemployment rate for countries like Benin is below 2%. In Europe, this would be called full employment. But in Africa, we mostly look at the quality of jobs because people are too poor to have the luxury of being unemployed. So people have some kind of job, but the problem is with the quality of the job. So when I talk about jobs throughout this presentation, I mostly refer to decent job, to formal sector jobs. Okay. So why do we observe this mismatch? Why do we have supply of labor increasing geometrically and demand of labor being so tiny? Again, demand for, a supply of good jobs. Enterprises offering good jobs to the household, to people. Here is one explanation. At the left-hand side of my screen, you have the share of labor-intensive exports, and you can see that it's plummeting. When I talk about labor-intensive exports, I refer to leather, apparel and clothing, footwear, textile, and the like. And on the right-hand side of my screen, what I'm showing is the share of capital-intensive exports like cement, chemicals, and the like. And you see that this is increasing. So this is one explanation why the economy is struggling to offer good jobs to young people, because sectors which are intensive in labor are just dwindling, while sectors which need less labor are, soaring. Now, I just would like to turn to one underlying conditions I referred to earlier in my presentation. Sectoral specialization. Everybody knows that manufacturing is the the much known reservoir for jobs for countries during their development process. That's why China has until recently and until now been considered as a factory of the world, because China has a lot of comparative advantage in manufacturing. But as countries grow and become richer, they lose their comparative advantage in manufacturing. But surprisingly, African countries have trouble developing their manufacturing sector. So we have identified some sectors with characteristics which are similar to manufacturing, and which I will turn on later on in my presentation. But let me just showcase here, looking at the case of Senegal, sectors which have greater than average level of productivity. What I have done is that I have taken each sector and I have computed their productivity and reported, divided each sector productivity by the national economy level of productivity. And you can see that mining has a higher than average level of productivity, manufacturing, utilities, transport and services, finance, and the like. And this is very important because in the next slide, I will show that these sectors with higher level of productivities are not the sectors which attract the most labor. If this had happened, we would have a structural transformation happening in Africa, and thus a desirable migration of labor from low productivity sector to high productivity sector. But it's not what we're having. I'm just drawing your attention to these sectors highlighted in red. Manufacturing is one. You can see that the share of manufacturing in total jobs is very, very, very limited, below 6%. Okay? The case of agriculture is also worth highlighting. You can see that agriculture is losing labor. Okay? The share of agriculture in total labor used to be 50% in 2001. And recently, it just plummeted to only 40%. If you look at mining, it's a sector with very important level of productivity, but it absorbs a little, a very small size of, a very small number of, it employs a very small number of people. Utilities are the same. So this is the main problem for African countries. The sectors which are booming, the sectors which are the most productive, are not the one which are absorbing the labor which were freed by agriculture. And I'm not insisting with this. This is just a bubble graph telling literally the same story. So I now would like to turn to what we have called industries without smokestacks. Industries without smokestacks are a concept which were developed by some authors like Page, Richard New Farmer, and the like. And this concept refers to some sectors which share a lot of similarities with manufacturing. First, they are tradable. Second, they generate a high level of value added per worker. Number three, they have a greater potential for technological change and productivity growth. And last but not least, they have display much more evidence of a scale and or agglomeration economies. The EWOS sectors we are focusing on in these presentations are agro-processing, horticulture, tourism, trade, and transport. And many studies have shown that African countries have a lot of comparative advantage in EWOS sectors than in manufacturing. So if you want to address and successfully address this issue of youth employment, we should pay a lot of attention on how we could push forward these EWOS sectors. I'll just skip this one. I have made some simulation about what the economy would look like if more effort was to be devoted to support the EWOS sectors. And these are the figures which appear here on this table, but I would not like to emphasize that. But how to get there? So I will stop on this last point. How to get there? How to make sure we reallocate resources from low productivity sectors to higher productivity sectors like manufacturing and EWOS. Everybody understands the issues African countries are facing to boost their manufacturing sectors. And the advantage with the EWOS sector is that they're much less demanding in terms of public support than manufacturing to be boosted. We still need some efforts to be done in order for these EWOS sectors to be mainstreamed in the economy. One is we need to clear the labor regulations. Labor regulations in Africa are, in particular Francophone Africa, are very stringent. We have classified 189 countries, but these figures are not displayed here based on the rigidity of the labor market. And for example, Senegal was ranked 187. Many of the Francophone African countries was ranked, was topping the ranking. So meaning that labor regulation in Francophone Africa is a very important issue. Another issue and related issue is labor cost. And labor cost is higher because of three reasons. Unions are very strong, so keeping salaries at a level which is not optimal. Number two, productivity is very low because labor cost is a ratio of salary to productivity. And number three, the exchange rate is often overvalued because we need to have labor costs, in dollar in order to make relevant comparison with other countries. So yeah, labor cost is high, and we need to make efforts on many fronts, on the exchange rate, on factors impeding productivity growth, and we need also to make some efforts in keeping the exchange rate aligned. Number two, the energy sector is very ineffective, and energy cost is a very significant barrier to competitiveness, and therefore that's why firms in the informal sector are struggling to generate jobs for household, for people, and in particular for young people. Another problem is the tax system. Tax rates in general are reasonable, but you have a lot of discretion in the hands of tax agents, and this is, translating onto the business environment in terms of a lack of transparency and red tapes for tax filing and payment. For example, we estimate that in Senegal, the representative firm spend up to 600 hours just to file and to pay taxes. And the same applies for custom clearance. So we have a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of inefficiencies happening in the economy and preventing formal firms from being competitive, from exporting, and then from offering decent jobs to the youth. So just to wrap up, migration, the type of migration I'm referring to in this presentation is internal migration. And internal migration usually is from villages to the cities. And we have some underlying economic factors which explain and which shape this type of migration. And this migration is something which is normal in the course of economic development. The problem in Africa is that we have a failure of what we call structural transformation. Sectors which could successfully absorb this supply of labor, this booming supply of labor, these sectors are just struggling to survive. So to me, the solution would be much more on the demand side. I mean, putting in place the right policies to boost these sectors. And of course, education is still needed, but unless the economy is running well and is competitive, it will be a challenge to absorb this booming labor supply, which is, supported by this also booming demographic trend. Mrs. Chair, it's these messages I wanted to share with you, and I thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Professor Mbaye, for this presentation. And we are already at almost 12 o'clock. We have about 15, 17 minutes to go. We had two very, very interesting presentations which are connected. Professor Hanoun spoke to us about external migration and the reasons why young people migrate. And he highlighted the fact that they don't migrate just for economic reasons. While the economics are important, there are more nuanced dimensions that take young people to migrate. This idea of looking for safety, the idea of developing oneself, the idea of becoming somebody, the idea of experiencing the world. And that makes absolutely sense in a time of globalization when the information and the new ICTs, information and technology and communications are so open that we can see what the other side offers and we want to experience it all. And so this idea of risk versus opportunity, whether death it's a deterrent enough or one is looking to become somebody, and also what it means in their own communities where they come from, whether they made it or not. And I find it interesting because in a certain way, it connects to the work that I've been doing on waithood and search for adulthood in younger generations. But this is also connected to what Professor Mbaye explained to us and the hardships of making that transition from youth into adulthood through having decent jobs, through a kind of a more secure employment. And I think Professor Mbaye made a very important point that everyone, we talk about unemployment, but everyone does something. Everyone hustles. Everyone tries to make ends meet because people are so poor that they are unable to to just cross their hands and wait for something to fall from somewhere. They have to do something. But the thing is that their types of jobs, they are very precarious jobs, and there is this discrepancy. And it was striking to see in the graph he showed on Senegal that a very large proportion of the population are in the informal sector. And so it also begs some type of understanding between, you know, what is formal and what is informal, because in a way, the majority of the population live in informality. So what is mainstream in our societies? And why do people who are struggling also have to migrate, not just internally, because as both speakers mentioned, the majority of migration happens within the continent. Although we hear more about the external migration to Europe, and we see these boats with young people dying out of moral panics created in Europe to kind of shut down young people's migration. So in this kind of, I would like to take 5 minutes and get some comments from both speakers. One on this idea of the need to become somebody, the need to overcome any threat and become somebody, not just for the individual, but also for the community. And then the second question related to that is, how can we, you know, apart from just doing the structural transformation, because I think structural transformation as an idea, we would all agree, but in practical terms, how young people struggling within the continent can really make ends meet and transform their own situation internally in the country. What kinds of interactions or dialogues or engagements need to happen between these large groups of young people struggling with employment and the policymakers, the institutions that can provide that employment? Because I think there is a disconnect between what they want and what the countries offer. But I guess in the discussion we could do this. Could we take about 5 to 7 minutes, 3 minutes each, to comment on those issues? Probably starting with Professor Hannu.
Yeah, I would. I don't pretend that I have the answers to these very important questions you asked, but I believe I can provide elements of answers that that can be developed or complemented by others. The first one that I want to say is that for the migrants that I worked with, and I stressed that in my presentation, I said that they are not poor. The overwhelming majority of them would not qualify as poor. As a matter of fact, like moving, let's say, from Mali or from Nigeria all the way to Morocco cost at least 7,000 euro. I mean, 7,000 euro is not a modest sum. I mean, even in the United States or in Europe, poor people do not save 7,000 euro. So this is really very important to stress. The other thing that I need to stress is, and they need to put it as a hypothesis, as a matter of fact, if these young people were rich, if they were rich, would they have moved? Yes, of course they would have moved. Would they have been migrants? No, they wouldn't have been migrants. Most likely, what would have happened is they would do exactly like, upper class or upper middle class Italians, British, French do, meaning they would explore the world on their own terms, So this is really very important because, like, as I said earlier, the economic factor is there, but it's not like the most important one. So what we have here is, like, as I said, I'm repeating myself, is the element of youth and the element of freedom. It's very, very important. And the element of like growth and the element of development, very, very important. So equally important is the fact that we are talking about a continent that has an unequal power relationship with another continent. We're talking about a continent that has a history of colonialism, with another continent. When we talk about colonialism, of course, we know what it is. It's a state of complete dependency, cultural, linguistic, economic, and so forth, that when it ended under the name of independence, it's continued. As a matter of fact, it's continued even maybe more severely. And therefore, you have this dependency of the former colonies, to, the former metropoles. That makes it that, like, you see what I mean? First of all, we really need to keep in mind the fact that, like, these waves of modern migration, they were initiated by colonial states themselves. As a matter of fact, they continued by, they continue to be encouraged by the post-colonial European state themselves, like, during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So therefore, we really have like roots, of migration, from Africa to Europe. Now, let's ask this question, because someone just asked me, and it's related to what you just said. The question of illegality. Someone said, how can we stop, this illegality? Well, the first thing that, if you want to stop illegality, is you have to lift the law that makes certain movements illegal. That's the first thing, because what creates illegality is the law. Michel Foucault has this, like, eloquent, like, phrase. He says, like, each time you have a prohibition, you have an entire field of illegality around it, So that's the first thing, that, like, because when you look at, like, it's virtually impossible for a European to become illegal in Africa. Why? Because they can't get there without a visa. We have, like, a significant, like, population, I would call them immigrants, as a matter of fact, in Morocco. They are not called illegal, and their illegality is impossible. Why? Because first of all, they can get in without a visa. Second, once they spend 3 months, they can just go visit their parents and come back. As a matter of fact, they don't even need to do that. They need just to cross to Spain. It takes like $30, and it takes half hour, and they can come back and start another 3 months. So when we talk about illegality, and when we talk about, like, youth movements from Africa, we really have to take into consideration 2 things: the history, that's colonial history, that, as I said, like, really created these connections of migration. And second, we have to take into consideration the present, that we call globalization, which is like another form of, like, unequal power between nations and even between continents.
Thank you so much, Professor Hanoum. And I would pick up on what you said about the unequal power relations and the weight of colonization, globalization, etc., as a segue to Professor Mbai's ideas of structural transformation. How can we do this structural transformation with this unequal power relations? And what comments would you be able to offer us that would kind of enlighten this question? Not just in kind of the economics of it, but also the political underpinnings and the social underpinnings of it.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My presentation was mainly about the nexus between migration and unemployment, and mainstreaming the economic factors behind this relationship. But if we consider migration, say, we have many layers of factors driving it and shaping it. Economic factors cannot be downplayed, but I fully agree that only economic factors cannot explain all. But anytime you have sources of livelihoods drying out, we expect migration flows to be encouraged. But of course, economic factors aren't the only set of factors behind migration. Geography is important. For example, when the terrain is rough, it is shown that usually people struggle to migrate, even when the will is there, when the desire to migrate is there, but the roughness of the terrain is a very important limiting factor. So geography cannot be ruled, also rule it out when talking about migration. The existence of networks is also important. Usually, migrants are attracted by areas where they find people from the same communities, where they can expect some kind of assistance to settle in and to properly deal with rules and regulation in host countries. So this also is a very important point. But security and freedom is also important, and my predecessor has highlighted that, and I've highlighted that, and I fully agree with him. We have many data showing that people migrate for hope and in search for a better life, where they can express themselves, where they can enjoy a more free society, etc., when they can move away from dictatorship, for example. So this set of factor is also important. Climate change, we can see that climate migration is now soaring, especially in the Sahel, and that is driven by livelihood dying out on the one hand, but also by conflict, because climate change is bringing about conflict. We have a lot of evidence showing that, and this conflict also are pushing people out of their localities. So climate change and climate migration is increasingly becoming a very important part of migration in Africa. So yeah, I totally agree with the take of my predecessor and the point you made, Madam Chair. Economic factors are important underlying factors, in particular for internal migration, but by no means they can be considered as the only factor shaping migration in Africa. Thank you very much.
We can't hear you. We cannot hear you.
Yes, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Professor Mbaye, for the comments, and Professor Hanoum. We will now move into a couple of questions from the audience. We have 2-3 minutes, but we can pick maybe one or other. I think you have addressed the issue of climate change. There is another question about tourism, and to what extent developing tourism could be a deterrent to migration and help develop local economies and for people to stay. And another one was more in terms of mining, whether mining whether mining was not labor intensive, although it was a productive sector, was not labor intensive. Maybe Professor Mbaye, quickly you could kind of address those. So I give 1 minute to each of you to answer the question, and then 1 minute to wrap up, because I'm getting a message that we should wrap up soon. We're running a little short on time.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. When we talk about unemployment, we can look at it using the supply and demand approach. Supply of labor is shaped by demography, and education affects the quality of labor. That is the supply side. But even when you educate almost everyone, if there is no enterprise to hire these people will remain unemployed. So you also need to look at the demand side. I mean, the economy. How effectively can the economy hire people, especially people who are looking for jobs? And in this regard, I would like to make the distinction between labor-intensive sectors and capital-intensive sectors. Labor-intensive sectors have huge potential to hire a greater number of people than capital-intensive sector. And the one labor-intensive sector economists used to look at when talking about generating jobs, good jobs, is manufacturing. But for different reasons, it will be too long to develop here. Manufacturing is failing to fill the gap in that regard. And we are trying to look at alternative sectors that can do the same job as manufacturing. And one of these sectors is tourism. Tourism doesn't require the same level of equipment, technology, capital, and the like as manufacturing. And it can offer the same quality job or similar quality job as manufacturing. You have talked about mining. Mining is a counterexample. Mining involves a lot of capital, a lot of equipment, and yet the number of jobs that the mining sector can create is very limited. Mm-hmm. So usually resource-rich countries, I mean, countries with a lot of potential for mining are encouraged to use the rents that mining provides to diversify their economy, to invest in sectors with high potential to create jobs. Mr. Chair, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mbai. I think that clarifies it for the audience. Professor Hanoum, would you like to make a 1-minute closing statement?
Yeah, just about this question of tourism. Like within Africa, let's say within a country such as Morocco, when people do so-called tourism inside, they don't think about as tourism. You know, when someone from Tangier go to Rabat, they're not saying like I'm going to Rabat for tourism, you know, because tourism like itself has history, and as a matter of fact, it has a colonial history as well. Tourism is the other way around. It's like when European during the colonial period, and we have all kind of like what's called guides, you know, especially the famous one was called Blue Guide, Michelin Guide, you know, that really kind of like there were industries, as a matter of fact, there were colonial industries that sold colonies, you know, to kind of like working class, like middle class in Europe. So it was more like Europeans, you know, that they would go to Asia, you know, they would go to Africa for, you know, tourism. Henri Lefebvre said the purpose of that really is to allow working class and middle class to have an elitist lifestyle that they cannot have in Europe, you know. So I will end with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both speakers. We had a very enlightened webinar on this topic of youth migration and employment. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us, and I'm sure we learned, you will agree with me that we learned a lot from this conversation, and we wish you all the best, and please continue to join the other panels at the LSE Africa Summit. Thank you very much, and bye-bye, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.